Aloha and welcome to the video on biological evolution. The goals for the video today are to define evolution, state the two theories that came from Darwin's work, and finally to describe how Mendel's work supports evolution. Okay, so to begin, let's talk about evolution. Evolution quite simply means change. So when we're talking about biological evolution, we're talking about the change in a species. So whether it's developing a new species or breaking one species into two species, we're talking about that changes in the gene pool. Now, evolution isn't a new idea. It's been around for an awful long time. People have realized that things change in nature, and as such, the animals need to change and the plants need to change as well. One of the early ideas of evolution came from a man by the name of Lamarck, and his ideas were pretty well thought out, but his mechanism was a little bit off, and that's why he was misunderstood and why his ideas didn't carry a lot of credit with them. What he believed in, and his idea that we always use as the giraffe, is that you had some short-necked giraffe. Okay, now we took some liberty with the pictures, and what happened was that original short-necked giraffe realized that if it stretched its neck just a little bit, it could reach up into the trees and get these leaves up a little bit higher. So because it stretched its neck, it passed that trait on to its child, who had a slightly longer neck, and then it was able to stretch its neck and reach up a little bit higher, a little bit higher, a little bit higher, and ultimately we ended up with a giraffe that way. Now, Lamarck believed in the passing on of acquired characteristics, which means that it's something that you would acquire in your lifetime you could pass on to your kids. But we know that's not the case. It's like if you're young and you decide to go get a tattoo and then you have kids later, your kids don't end up with the same tattoo. So that's what we were talking about. So he had the idea, he hadn't thought of how it worked, but his mechanism wasn't right, and that's why his idea didn't carry through. Okay, so when we're talking about evolution, this is the name you always hear, Charles Darwin. So who was Charles Darwin? Charles Darwin was a naturalist on the HMS Beagle. He was British, and you can see him right over here. Now, Charles Darwin sailed around the world. He left from England on the Beagle and sailed around the world. Areas of interest were the Galapagos, and we'll talk about that one a lot when we talk about evolution. But his job as a naturalist was to collect specimens and to take observations as they went around the world. And he did this with great detail. In the Galapagos, he saw a bunch of finches, his birds here, and you'll hear about them a lot as well. These finches were so diverse of a group of birds that it stuck with him. He kept thinking about this throughout this whole trip. But also, when he got back for about 10 years, he was thinking about it and came up with an idea of how it could happen and was trying to make sure that his idea was well-rounded before he presented it to the public. We see another individual down here. His name is Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace was also a British naturalist, and he came up with this idea of natural selection independently of Darwin. So he had actually came up with this idea and then contacted Darwin in a letter and said, hey, I have this idea. I'm not sure what you think about it. I'd love to hear back from you. And that was the catalyst that Darwin needed to present his work out to the public. So prior to that, he had been just working on it and trying to answer all the questions that people would have. And that's why he wrote his book on the origin of species, so that when he presented it, he would have a complete argument. And it was Wallace that kind of pushed him to the point where, okay, it's time to present this out to the world. So when you hear about Darwin, it was basically he went around the world, he got that what if question moments, and then he spent time trying to come up with a mechanism, and his mechanism of natural selection is one that we see that worked. Okay, so Darwin's idea on evolution had two main points. The first one was descent with modification, and that just means that species evolved or changed from a previous species. And we can kind of see what we're talking about over here, where we have a common ancestor, and then over time it was going to split, and when it split, part of them evolved into birds and the other part evolved into mammals. So descent with modification just means that as species evolve, they evolve from something else, but the reason we say they're evolving is because they have this change, this modification. Now, the other idea was natural selection. Natural selection is a biggie. That was a mechanism that worked for evolution. And what it basically says is that initially in each species there's variation. So we'll go back to the giraffes and we see we have a short-necked giraffe and a longer-necked giraffe. Now, the giraffes are in the same area. There's going to be some kind of competition for basic needs like food, living space, water, the ability to reproduce, things of that nature. So these two individuals were going to be in competition with each other. Now, the better adapted, okay, would survive. So that's where we see this survival of the fittest thing. So when we're sitting here and we look here and all the low branches have been eaten, that giraffe with a taller neck was able to feed up in the trees, so it has an advantage. It's able to live a little bit longer. It's able to get food and be a little bit healthier. Because it's able to live a little bit longer, or because it's healthier, then it's going to be the primary one for reproduction. And then if that's the primary one for reproduction, then this longer neck is going to start showing up more and more in the population. So natural selection basically means that nature's going to select which variant is better to survive, and then that survival is going to be passed through reproduction onto future generations. And that's how we evolve into a new species. Now, when we talked about heredity, we talked a little bit about Gregor Mendel, and we talked about his work with the pea plants and how he discovered that there were different alleles and the whole science of heredity. Had Darwin known this at his time, it would have made his book and his job a whole lot easier. Okay, Darwin had a hard time with how these ideas were being passed from one generation to the other. Even though that Mendel had done this work, it was still locked up and not shared. So it took a while for Mendel's work to find its way out into the public. And once it did, it kind of vindicated Darwin in a little ways in the fact that he was able to say, now I know it's right because it works this way. But we want to talk about how the importance of this goes through, because now we had not only the mechanism for choice, which was natural selection, but we also had a way for things to be passed from one generation to the other. So we weren't relying on acquired characteristics like Lamarck. We had the work of Mendel. Okay, so let's talk about the modern synthesis theory. And this is where we blend together the ideas of Darwin and Mendel. And this is our current theory of evolution. It has three different parts. From Mendel, we recognize that genes are responsible for the inheritance of characteristics. So that means that the alleles for a specific gene are passed on from parent to offspring. And that's how we get that genetic material going from generation to generation. The other part is that it happens in populations. Evolution isn't an individual thing, it is a population thing. And those populations are going to change in their genetic frequency based on natural selection and genetic drift. And then finally, we want to recognize that speciation is a gradual accumulation. So that means it takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. It takes a long time for a species to happen. So that's it for our video. Good luck with the lesson, and as always, we'll see you in the next videos. Aloha and welcome to our video on the evidence of evolution. Today in the video we're going to describe how fossils support the theory of evolution, as well as biogeography, continental drift, anatomy, and molecular biology all provide evidence for evolution. Okay, so to begin, let's talk about fossils. And we can see we have a fossil fish here. Now, fossils give us a record of past life. Okay, it's things that have happened before in time. So it gives us an idea or a way that we can travel back in time and see what was here. Now, fossils are rare. They happen in sedimentary rock. So you start off with some kind of a sediment here, and then you'll have a fish or some other organism will die and it'll land down and sink into the sediment. And those sediments will then proceed to layer on top of it. And over time, minerals come in through and they replace the organic material, and that's how we end up with our fossil fish here. So it's not a common thing to find them. The thing that fossils do for us is they give us a clue as to what was living a long time ago. And that's the key, is it gives us a record of the different types of living things that have been on the planet. Okay, so when we're talking about evolution, one of the key things is we need to have time. So you can see down here we have a chart showing us the geologic time scale. And you can see that the Earth was created 4.6 billion years ago, way back here in the Precambrian times. Okay, and then you can see that it breaks to about this 542 million years ago. So all of this area here is what we call the Precambrian time. And that's going to be the older, lot less variety of life and things of that nature. From there, we can see how we break it down a little bit more. And the reason being is we have a little bit more opportunities to find evidence from these time periods. So here's another representation of the geologic time scale. And what we've done is we've taken it to represent one day. So you can see the formation of the Earth, which is actually 4.6 billion years ago, is when the Earth formed. And we can see that it wasn't until 2 o'clock in the morning that we had solid rocks, and not until 4 o'clock in the morning did we have life. Okay, so our oldest fossils are from 5:30 in the morning, and then we notice here at 6 o'clock a big change. Oxygen starts to begin to accumulate. So at 6 o'clock we see evidence of photosynthesis. Okay. At 1:52 in the afternoon, almost 2 o'clock, oxygen reached its current levels, and then we finally get to algae here at 2 o'clock. Okay, and then you can follow up. You can see that we have here the Cambrian explosion. Land plants didn't come until 9:52 at night. Dinosaurs were at almost 11 o'clock. Mammals came at about 11:39, and here, just 17 seconds before midnight, is where we have evidence of the first humans. So you can see that we haven't been around for that long if you take it the entire time period of the Earth. And that's kind of what we're showing, is that we have an awful lot of time from the origin of life here to us for evolution to occur. Now, one of the topics you'll hear about is biogeography, and that's basically the geography of life. Where is it evolved? What type of environment is it in? And we recall back to Darwin and his finches, we talk about the Galapagos Islands, and we can kind of see it here, that we have a species that arrived on island A there. Okay, now species B split from A, and it may have moved over to here, or some of the A may have gone and B could have evolved there. We'll see C do the same thing and D do this as well. So what you notice is that because it's an island area, we can see that each of the islands promotes its own speciation. Each of the areas that the animals can live, some other trait might be selected for by nature, and that's why we see this speciation going across. Now, continental drift is another one. 225 million years ago, it was believed that all of the land masses were locked together in what we called Pangaea, one supercontinent. And over those past 225 million years, these continents have migrated and moved to their present-day locations. And by looking at this, we can see how populations that would have once thrived here were together, and that's why we see similarities. So if we look at monkeys, monkeys are found here, and they're found here in the world, and that's because a long time ago they were together. So that's when they had those original primates, the original monkeys, and then they evolved into different species. And the new world monkeys here and the old world monkeys there, while they're both primates, there are distinctions between the two. Okay, so we can see that there's that evidence that evolution has changed, and that's what we're talking about. We're seeing that change in the life, and that's all evolution is. Okay, plate tectonics is just incorporates continental drift into it, and when you take an earth science class, you'll learn a lot more about that one. Now we can also see evidence for evolution when we look at what we call homologous structures. Okay, and homologous is going to be similar. Okay, so if we take three different animals here, we have a penguin, which is a bird, an alligator, which is a reptile, a human, and a bat, both of which are mammals, and we take a look at their forearms here. What we notice is there's one single solitary bone here, okay, and that would be the humerus, and you can see it there. And then we have a pair of bones here, the radius and ulna, okay, and then we have our carpals, and then our phalanges, our carpals and phalanges, our carpals and phalanges, so on and so forth. So even though we're four not closely related species by any means, we all share the same pieces and parts, and that kind of shows this homologous structure, shows us that there was a common ancestor that probably had the bones in that alignment. Okay, molecular biology has also given us evidence for evolution, because what we can do is we can look at the genetic material, and we can see that at some point in time it was the same, and then we split into two populations. One population just kept it the same, the other population had a mutation, and we can see that. And we can see how closely these two species are related if we compare the modern gene sequencing here. So we can look at the nucleotides and pair them up and see how similar these two species are. So that gives us an idea that we can find how closely related species are, or where species might have evolved from, and that paints an interesting picture, but it also gives us a lot of evolutionary evidence. Okay, so in summary, we have a couple different pieces of evidence. We had the fossil record, and by examining a fossil record, it gives us information about when things lived and how they may have changed. We also have biogeography, which is finding a pattern of the way things are distributed, or looking at where animals live or plants live, and that gives us evidence for evolution as well. We talked about comparative anatomy by looking at homologous structures, and then finally we talked about molecular biology and how we can compare DNA. So that's it for this video. Good luck with the lessons. They'll go into everything in a little more detail, and as always, we'll see you in the next video. Aloha and welcome to our video on processes in evolution. We're going to describe how changes will occur in the gene pool, and then we'll also talk a little bit about the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium principle. Okay, so first we're going to talk about the processes in evolution. If you recall, with evolution, we're talking about a population of organisms, not a single individual. And that population has to change the gene pool. So it's a genetic change. So what we need to do is we need to find a way of changing or introducing a new allele, or we have to change the selection on the alleles that are being chosen for. And that's how we can get a change in the gene pool and then in turn evolution of a new species. So the first way is through mutation, and mutation quite simply is changing the sequence of the DNA. And there are three easy mutations. We can have an insertion where we put in a new nucleotide, or a deletion where we take one out, or a substitution where we simply switch them. And the results of any of those can be a change in the protein that's being made, and that can be an advantage or a disadvantage. And if it's advantageous, the population over time may choose that allele, or that way it'll be more survival, so they'll have more offspring. Now, a couple other ways are recombination. Recombination, if you remember in meiosis, when we had the crossing over, we can kind of join them up in a little bit of a different pair. So two normally unrelated genes, we can create a new pair for them, and that pair together might be advantageous and then selected for. We also have gene flow, and that's going to be the movement of genes into or out of a population. So that would mean if we introduced a new member to the population with a different trait, that trait might be advantageous, and then that would lead to more breeding, more reproduction, and we could have a change in that frequency, and that would be what could cause the evolution. The same is true as if something moves out and it's no longer there, then we can also see these changes. Now, if it's a smaller population, we can have genetic drift. Okay, and a lot of times that happens after a natural disaster with what's left, or if you have a small population, that'll be because there's not as big of a pool, so a little change is going to be a little bit more pronounced. And then finally, we mentioned that we can also see evolution if we change what we're selecting for. Okay, so if we have a change in the environment, then it may choose a different allele, and that might change the population. So if you think back to our example about the moths, when we had a change in the environment, the population changed. So that would be a change in natural selection. Now, two scientists that dealt with these allele frequencies, or the percentages of the alleles in a population, were Hardy and Weinberg. And what their equilibrium means is that the frequencies in a population don't change unless an evolutionary factor is acting on the population. So things are the way they are unless something's going to happen and cause a change. And that kind of makes sense. Okay, in the equation, which you can see down here, our P is generally going to be our dominant frequency, and then our Q is going to be our recessive allele frequency. Okay, so as always, the lessons will go into a little more detail. Good luck with them, and we will see you in the next video. Aloha and welcome to our video on natural selection. In the video today, we're going to define what artificial selection is, and then we'll go over what natural selection is. Okay, so let's begin with a talk real quickly about artificial selection. Artificial selection is exactly what it sounds like, artificial or man-made selection. And the prime example for this one is if we take an ancestral wild dog, what we've been able to do is by selectively choosing which puppies we breed, we've been able to come up with different breeds of dogs. And that's kind of how the system works. And what we're doing is instead of nature making the selective choice, we're doing that. So if we wanted a little dog, we would breed the little ones together until we have the traits that we're looking for. Now, we don't only do that with dogs, we do that with cats, we've done it with other farm animals, and we can also do it with plants. if you take a look down here, we have a wild mustard. And that wild mustard plant, what we were able to do, like Mendel did, is cross-pollinate it. And from that wild mustard, we were able to get a whole bunch of different types of plants coming from it, from cauliflower and broccoli to cabbage and kale, and even down to kohlrabi. So you can see that what we've been able to do is take one plant, and by picking the traits we wanted to accentuate, that's our selection part here, we were able to determine what we were making from that. Okay, so now let's talk about natural selection. In natural selection, nature is the one that's selecting or choosing which traits are going to be more advantageous. So nature plays a role in that whichever traits it chooses, that's those individuals that possess those traits are going to be better apt to survive. And then being better apt to survive, they will have a better chance of reproduction. Now, natural selection has 4 different parts. The first part here is what we call overproduction, and that means that organisms produce more offspring that can survive. So by having more children out there, or more offspring out there, the ones that can survive will, the ones that don't survive, well, okay. But it's producing way too many kids. Now, in that population, there's going to be a variety of traits. So these traits are going to be recorded in the alleles, and those alleles are passed on in the DNA from parent to offspring, generation to generation. But you have to have a variety of things for nature to select against. If everything was exactly the same and you change the environment against it, nothing would be able to change and they would all go extinct. So you have to have some underlying variety in the population. Now, the individuals with the alleles that are best suited are most likely to survive. So that means that as nature's applying its pressure, those that have the traits that make it so it adapts better, those are the ones that are going to survive. They're going to be a little more healthy. Because they're able to survive longer and because they're healthier, then they have the better chance of reproduction. And when they reproduce and they overproduce, their offspring will have the same traits. And that's how we see this choosing of that trait that fits in a little better. And that can be the driving force for evolution. So over time, we're seeing that the gene pool of the population is going to change. Right? And that's what natural selection does. It picks some of the traits out of the variety of options, and whichever ones are better suited to survive, those are the ones that are going to reproduce more, and that's how we see that gene flow. Okay, so let's take a really quick example of this one. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look here at a beetle population. Now, the beetle population has 2 different variants, so there's a little bit of variety here. We can have either a green beetle or we can have a brown beetle. Okay, so in the alleles, and that's what this heredity part is showing me, is we can look and see that we can have a homozygous green, we can have a homozygous brown, or we can have heterozygous, and what we see is that the brown variety is going to be the dominant variety. Okay, so now when we have these offspring and they hatch and they're like living on the trees, we notice our predator here, and our predator is going to be able to see the green ones and they'll feed on that one a little bit easier. And that'll leave these brown ones. So nature, in the form of the bird, is selecting for the brown coloration because that blends in better. So even though these brown ones may be either homozygous or heterozygous, because of that, we don't lose the green in the population, but the greens aren't going to have a better chance of reproducing. So that's how natural selection works. Nature's going to make a choice, and the individuals that are able to survive a little bit better, those are the ones that are going to reproduce, and that's how we can see a shift in the population. Okay, so one more example and then we'll be done for the day. So first of all, remember we had the overproduction. So we have a grasshopper that's going to lay 200 eggs here, okay? And not all of them are going to survive, but it's going to produce too many. Remember, that was overpopulation. Then we have this variation in the population, and you can see that we have a light brown tan colored variant, and we also have a green variant here. Nature's going to come in and survival of the fittest happens, and once again it's going to pick the one that doesn't blend in well, so all of these brown ones are going to be chosen or selected against. So the green one is the fittest. It has that adaptation that allows it to survive, which means the green ones are going to have a better chance at reproduction, And that's why we see a population that'll over time turn more and more green. But because we don't lose the other variation in case something happens to the population, it can survive if need be, if there's a dramatic change. Okay, so that's what natural selection is. As always, you'll get to go through the lessons and pick it up in a little more detail, but I wanted you to kind of understand what it is. Good luck on the lessons, and as always, we'll see you in the next video. Aloha and welcome to the microevolution and macroevolution video. We're going to define what those terms are and give you an example of microevolution. We'll compare phenotypic changes in evolution, and then finally we'll define what evolutionary biology is. Okay, so we have microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution is changes in gene frequencies within a population, so it's going to be within a species. That's what microevolution is. It's small. And macroevolution is going to be new taxonomic groups, so species and things greater than that. It's going to be a larger scale. So micro is going to be small, macro is going to be larger scale. Our example of microevolution, and we've talked about this one before, is our little beetle, and how changes in pressure are going to change the gene frequencies within that population. That's micro. It's not a new species yet, or it's just going to be a variant of the species, or you're just going to see a little bit of a drift of the genes. Macroevolution is when we start to see new species form, or even bigger than that. New genus form, new classes form. That's going to be something on a grander scale. So micro is going to deal with a population, macro is going to deal with a much larger group of organisms. Okay, an example of microevolution would be this guy right here, our Biston betularia moth. This guy here was chosen prior to the Industrial Revolution because the trees that it lived on were light in color, and that's what was selected for it. The birds couldn't see those through predation, and you saw this in the lab. And post Industrial Revolution, we saw the accumulation of silt, and these darker variants were going to be selected for. So remember, micro is within a population, and this is one population of moth that we could see a shift from this variant to the darker variant just because of an environmental change. Okay, now, just because we have a change in phenotype doesn't necessarily mean that it's evolution. It can be a selective choice. It can be a variant inside of a population. We as human beings are living longer. It has nothing to do with evolution. It's more because we have better health care. We're a little bit bigger because we have better nutrition. We're a little bit heavier because we don't follow that nutrition. But we can see changes in a population that aren't necessarily evolution. Okay, it's just the way that we play out, the way that we develop. Okay, and then finally we have evolutionary biology, and that's going to be the scientific study of evolution. So that's it for the video. Just real quickly went through it. Just wanted you to get a quick taste of what's going on. As always, you'll explore it a little bit more in the lessons. Good luck on them, and we'll see you in the next video.